Hello, my name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. We're here today to discuss Chapter 5 of The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt. Chapter 5 is the first chapter in Book 2 of The Origins of Totalitarianism on Imperialism. Book 2 begins with an epigraph by Cecil Rhodes. I would annex the planets if I could. And this first chapter, chapter 5, is called The Political Emancipation of the Bourgeoisie. And it is about the connection between the bourgeoisie, politics, expansion, or imperialism, because imperialism is the political theory of expansion, power, race, and ideology. These are the main concepts. But the core ones, which we'll come back to, are imperialism, expansion, the bourgeoisie, and power. And trying to understand those concepts in this chapter will be essential. Above all, the chapter wants to make the argument that imperialism, which is a non-political idea, it's an idea imported from economy out of absolute growth, comes into politics with the rise of the bourgeois class, the bourgeoisie, a class that has as its fundamental drive the accumulation of ever more and more power. And an unlimited accumulation of power requires an unlimited politics, thus not a national politics, but an imperialist politics. And so we are going to try and understand that. It begins with the first section of the chapter. There's three official sections of the chapters of chapter 5, and then one sort of coda. So it begins with the expansion of the nation state, which is about the disintegration of the nation state and the rise of expansion and imperialism as a political principle. It follows with power in the bourgeoisie, with a long discussion of Hobbes and the psychological desire for power at the root of the bourgeois class. Then a section on the alliance between capital and the mob, and then finally a coda on power, imperialism, and race, and how race will get brought into this question of imperialism and the bourgeoisie. Let's start then with this first section on expansion and the nation state. She begins by saying, quoting Cecil Rhodes again, "Expansion is everything," said Cecil Rhodes. Remember, Cecil Rhodes offered the epigraph to the section. I would annex the stars if I could. Cecil Rhodes is an English imperialist who ends up building and taking over much of South Africa. South Africa was the area in which, for Arendt, imperialism took on its most brutal and most unlimited and thus most natural form. And so she will spend some time talking about Rhodes in South Africa. But the idea here is that Cecil Rhodes, in saying expansion is everything, and saying he would annex the stars if he could, got to the very heart of imperialism. And that heart is the moving principle that she calls. So she says, he had discovered the moving principle of the new imperialist era. Expansion is everything. And that's the key insight. To understand that is to understand much of this book. Because one of the principles of totalitarianism is that it is an infinitely expanding idea. It's totalizing, which means that if you ever achieve some end, if you ever achieve some goal, the totalitarianism would end. Because the premise of totalitarianism is it has to keep the people moving. It has to keep them believing in the future. Otherwise, they would be satisfied with what they have. They'd want a stable government, and they wouldn't want terror and torture and the kind of control that totalitarianism requires. And so the beginning of this idea of totalitarianism as a movement, which when we read the sections on totalitarianism will become key, has its root in this idea of infinite expansion, which itself is rooted in imperialism, which itself we're going to see is rooted in the secret desires of bourgeois man and bourgeois society. On page 126, Arendt writes, "Imperialism was born when the ruling class in capitalist production came up against national imitations to its economic expansion. The bourgeoisie turned to politics out of economic necessity, for it did not want to give up the capitalist system, whose inherent law is constant economic growth. It had to impose this law upon its home governments and to proclaim expansion to be an ultimate political goal of foreign policy." So the bourgeoisie, through capitalism, acquired tons of surplus capital, and yet as the workers gained more money and more rights and more stability, they demanded more money and better wages, and there was fewer people to sell things to. The ability to make ever more amounts of money decreased, and so the ruling class wanted cheap labor that it could dominate and suppress and oppress, and the place it could find that cheap labor was not in the nation state, but in the undeveloped world. And so we encounter her discussion of Rosa Luxemburg, who says that imperialism is actually central to capitalism, that capitalism always needs a non-capitalist people to oppress and to exploit in order for capitalism to keep growing. And the general point that she's making here on page 126, and she continues it when she in a second, is that imperialism as a politics comes from economics. And so she'll say, in contrast to the economic structure, the political structure cannot be expanded indefinitely. In other words, politics requires limits. We have moral limits. We have a sense that we are Americans, or we are Germans, or we are Japanese, we are Russians, and you have to, in order to imagine ourselves as part of a national community, there are limits. Economic structure has no limits. Cash is fungible. A dollar and a ruble and a yen can be exchanged, and so you can store up infinite amount of cash, or not cash, but money, which is an idea, and it doesn't have a limit, whereas politics has limits. And she continues, of all forms of government and organizations of people, the nation state is least suited for unlimited growth, because the genuine consent at its base cannot be stretched indefinitely, and is only rarely and with difficulty won from conquered peoples. The nation state, in the end, is a state of a nation. It's a people that see themselves as a unit, and that there's a kind of consent in the government. And it's rare that if the United States goes and conquers the Philippines, that the Philippines is going to want to simply become part of the United States. And so imperialism is an infinite expansion is very difficult for a nation state. And yet, if expansion, as she says on page 125, and this is a key part, expansion as a permanent and supreme aim of politics is the central idea of imperialism, the central political idea of imperialism. What that means is that expansionism and imperialism sit very poorly, only with great difficulty, with the nation state. She says the nation state can't think that it is justified in conquering other peoples, because it thinks that the other peoples, just like itself, are national peoples that have their own legitimacy. And thus on page 128 she speaks of the inner contradiction between the consent of the body politic and conquest. And thus imperialism and nationalism sit very only with great difficulty together. And that is one of the beginning points here, that imperialism brings in a disruptive, non-national approach to politics, one that's only that leads to this idea of infinite expansion as its political principle. Part 2 of this chapter is called Power and the Bourgeoisie. And the premise here, again, is to move from the political expression of imperialism in Part 1 and looking at actual examples of imperialism to what she would, I guess, think of as the psychology or the philosophy underlying it. We're not looking at the economic grounds of imperialism now, but we are looking at a kind of superstructure argument. The idea here is that since imperialism is an economic import into politics, it is the kind of politics that is engaged in by economical man, or homo economicus, the man that is driven mostly by economics. And that man is the bourgeoisie. And so she writes on page 138, imperialism must be considered the first stage in the political rule of the bourgeoisie rather than the last stage of capitalism. So even though in the first part we have an economic argument that imperialism begins with the breakdown of capitalism and with the rise of superfluous wealth seeking superfluous labor, the more important, or in her sense, the more central argument is not an economic argument, but an argument about the bourgeoisie. It is about the sort of psychology or philosophy of bourgeois man. And here is where we understand the connection between power in imperialism and power in the bourgeoisie. On page 135, she talks about how the deepest desire of imperialism is, quote, expansion of political power without the foundation of a body politic. We want to expand, infinite expansion of political power. But we want to keep the body politic. England stays in England, not in India. And so we want to expand, but keep the center of power stable. The bourgeoisie's deepest desire, she says on page 137, is, quote, an empty desire to have money beget money. An empty desire to have money beget money. What the bourgeoisie wants is to make more and more and more money without risk, without difficulty. And so on 137, she can say, once the bourgeoisie convinces the political power to send its armies out to help the bourgeoisie create factories and oppress workers so that they can make money in imperialism. She says, quote, money could finally beget money. That's what imperialism gave the bourgeoisie. Because power, with complete disregard for all laws, economic as well as ethical, could appropriate wealth. What imperialism does is allow power and money to grow, expand infinitely, in disregard for laws and in disregard for all economic as well as ethical laws. The aim of imperialism is money, but money as simply a marker of power. And so she'll say that the highest aim of politics and imperialism is not violence, is not even money. It is power and ever more power. And money gives you power. And so she can write on page 138 that every political body develops, quote, stabilizing forces which stand in the way of constant transformation and expansion. And what imperialism has to do is destroy those stabilizing forces so that we can have an infinite increase in power. Thus, imperialism for her means, quote, as a logical consequence on page 137, the destruction of all living communities. Insofar as it's constantly expanding and seeking ever more power, any living community which automatically, as she says, develops stabilizing forces has to be destroyed. What is a living community? Well, it's a community with norms and customs and rules, and imperialism destroys that. And it does so in the service of power. And so on 138, she'll write, power became the essence of politics when it was separated from the political community which it should serve. Power became the essence of politics when it's separated from the community which it should serve and seeks to expand out of it. Because once power is outside of England as sort of an imperialist power, it becomes unlimited because it doesn't have a living community that it respects, and it violates all ethical, economic, and other rules in order to increase more power. And the bourgeoisie, she says, is connected to this idea because this idea of infinite expansion of power, quote, perfectly answered the hidden desires and secret convictions of the economically and socially dominant classes. In other words, the bourgeoisie had a secret desire to have money beget money, power beget power. And thus, for the bourgeoisie, she writes, quote, on page 138, imperialism must be considered the first stage in political rule of the bourgeoisie rather than the last stage of capitalism. Now, there's a long digression in this chapter on Thomas Hobbes, which is actually quite fascinating. But the premise here is that writing in the 17th century, long before imperialism, she dates imperialism to the 1870s as its real beginning. Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan and other books in which he sought to understand politics in a world in which power was the dominant idea. And she argues that long before the bourgeoisie or imperialism, Hobbes offered the political and psychological grounds for imperialism. And the fundament of that, I'm just going to give you a couple of quotes that she takes from Hobbes that are, I think, central, is that on page 139, she writes that for Hobbes, the desire for power must be the fundamental passion of the bourgeois man. That is the key driving force of much of this book. One of the things that we're going to see is that her argument is that totalitarianism is in many ways the secret desire of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie want money to beget money. They want power to beget power. And in order for that to happen, you need to erase as many of the ethical, legal, and other limits that prevent the infinite expansion of power and money. On page 140, she says that for Hobbes, he understood that if man's aim is to acquire power, he has an obstacle, other men. And since all men are equal, insofar as they can kill each other, what power requires, infinite power, is in some sense a justification to kill other men. It needs also a protection against other men. And that protection against other men is what Hobbes is going to call government, which comes in and says, all right, here are the rules by which, according to which, you can acquire as much power as you want. You can do anything you want as long as you don't violate these rules. And that is the essence of bourgeois government, which is what Hobbes calls a liberal democracy. Leviathan, she writes on page 142, is a community based solely on power, on the idea that power must decay in the calm of order and stability. And if power must decay in calm and stability, we want a government that allows as much power seeking as possible, thus as little calm and security as possible, but just the bare amount. And that's what liberal government is for Hobbes. And on 143, she adds that the realization that power accumulation was the only guarantee for the stability of so-called economic laws made progress irresistible. In a sense, the way we create stability is not by creating stable living communities, but by making constant progress inevitable. which is very much the idea of creative destruction of laissez-faire capitalism. And so the idea here is that another idea of Hobbes is the idea that there is no reason for man. There's no truth. There's only reckoning with consequences. And in reckoning with consequences, we say there is no ultimate truth. There's no limit. There's no morality. There's no ethics. What there is if it works, if it creates more power, it's good, and we accept it. The third section is about the alliance between mob and capital. The basic idea here is that the mob, which is the refuse of the working class, the beginning of this idea of the mass, are these superfluous people, and the bourgeoisie need them to work, and they send them out, but they don't want to send them into the nation state to work because there's rules and regulations and there's too much of that, so they send them out to places where they can better oppress them. And so the idea here is that the bourgeoisie needs the mob, and the mob needs the bourgeoisie economically. But there's another more important, I think, element of this chapter, which is not just economic, but morality, which is that the mob has an idea of anything goes as long as we get what we want. They are the refuse of the working class, of all the classes, and they are thus increasingly without any limits or morality. And what she says is that the bourgeoisie secretly admired the mob. The bourgeoisie, has a certain amount of respectability. They go to the opera, they get dressed nice. But what they really wanted to do was just wear ripped jeans and shirts and not take showers and live with the kind of freedom from morality of the mob, because that's how you make the most amount of money and acquire the most amount of power. And that, in a sense, the bourgeoisie had to wear this hypocritical mask so that they would be respectable. And as the mob acquired power, the bourgeoisie found the mob fascinating, and they admired the mob, and that it's actually that admiration for the mob that begins the move of the bourgeoisie to throw off moral standards, and to see moral standards as actually hypocritical. The coda to this book, the last 2 pages of this chapter on the political emancipation of the bourgeoisie, deals with race. And I just want to read 2 quotes, and we'll end. The philosophy of Hobbes contains nothing of modern race doctrines. This is on page 157. The philosophy of Hobbes contains nothing of modern race doctrines, which not only stir up the mob, but in their totalitarian form outline very clearly the forms of organization through which humanity could carry the endless process of capital and power accumulation through to its logical end of self-destruction. But Hobbes at least provided political thought with the prerequisite for all race doctrines, that is, the exclusion in principle of the idea of humanity, which constitutes the sole regulating idea of international law. Hobbes himself didn't employ race in his thinking, at least directly. There are people who've begun to look for race in Hobbes' thinking, but for Arendt, it's not key. But what he does do is attack the idea of humanity. The idea of the humanity, which she says a little further along, is the idea that there's a common origin of the human species. Now, Hobbes is equal, right? That's part of his sort of attraction to liberal democracy. But what he says is, man is a power-seeking proton. Man's basic desire is more power, more money, more influence, but more power. And if that's the case, anyone who gets in my way is someone that needs to be eliminated. Now, we have a basic rules and structures, right? This is part of it. We want a legal playing field. But if we can say those people over there, the yellow people or the black people or the other people or the Jews or the Muslims or whoever, they're not really people. And we can enslave them or take their land or expropriate them, we can acquire a lot more power. And so even though Hobbes does not himself use race as a justification for the infinite accumulation of power, his philosophy provides political thought with the prerequisite for race doctrines, which is that if we can come up with a reason, we can justify racism, slavery, imperialism through as acquisitions of power. And so she concludes, if the idea of humanity, of which the most conclusive symbol is the common origin of the human species, is no longer valid, then nothing is more plausible than a theory according to which browns are descended from some other species of apes than the white race, and that all together are predestined by nature to war against each other until they have disappeared from the face of the earth. One will win. And that increase of power is what it means to be human, and thus we can understand the history of humanity as a contest of races, and if that's the case, then our race better win. And so this idea of infinite expansion, rooted in the infinite acquisition of power, is the preparation for a kind of racialized expansion, which will lead to totalitarianism. I look forward to discussing this chapter with you. Thanks very much.